Okay, so my engineering disaster was the Chernobyl disaster. An overview of the Chernobyl disaster. It was a major nuclear disaster that happened April the 26th, 1986. It was a nuclear power plant in Ukraine, made by the USSR, kept a secret for most part until the events of April 26th, 1986. There are still repercussions of this event that happened over 30 years ago. I believe it's 35, 36 years now. People living around the area developed cancers, including children, which they'd lived with for all their life. I believe it was two people died initially when the blast happened, and I believe many hundreds more, at least 58, died months later of radiation, and many are still living with radiation effects. So what caused this? There's routine tests being run on one of the four reactors, as you can see pictured here. As you see pictured here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So basically, what happened was they were seeing if the reactors themselves could sustain power enough to run the fans to cool the reactors when there was no power, because the reactors are insanely what's the word for it? I don't want to use. They're unstable. So if they get too hot, they will explode. Well, that's what happened here. It basically, like when you have you've seen those Mentos and Coke things. It's basically like that. It blew the top clean off. As you can see in the picture here, here's before. And if we go to the next slide, here's an after. That's reactor number 4, 2, or 3, 2, and 1. Basically, when this one blew, it sent some debris over here. And then this one, they had to, in shifts of, I believe, at least 5 minutes to 7 minutes was the maximum they could do because they didn't want to get radiation. It was 5 to 6 here to clean this up, and then they had to basically turn these off immediately as they could. But it actually took a whole day before they could get these, before they started to turn these off, because they didn't treat it as big of a disaster as it actually was. There's obviously speculation if it was human error or poor design. I'll go over more of that in what could we have done to prevent this, which is coming up next, I believe. Well, actually, the aftermath comes up next. But so what was left over after all this? Well, as you can see in all these pictures, not much. This was the floor of Reactor 4, and this was the control panel of Reactor 4. As you can see, it's burned everywhere. This is just rubble. And this was as you can see in this, it was supposed to be this, but it just became this. A lot of radiation went off nearby. People felt it in Europe, Eastern Europe. There was another nuclear power plant in Eastern Europe that actually reported having their alarms go off when their employees walked in on the 28th of April, 1986, because the radiation had spread so far that it was on the people's clothes. They started setting off their alarms. So then that's when the USSR had to take accountability and really say, yes, this happened. We can't cover this up anymore. Sorry, went backwards. So what could have been done to prevent this? Well, as you know, the test did not go as planned. It actually took part at nighttime instead of during the daytime when it was originally scheduled to have been taking place. The reason for this was because it was to conserve power and make not as many people be affected by the power outage for the short time. Also, this might have caused part of the human error, which was people were sleep deprived. People they were not senior engineers. They could have done it during the morning to be have senior engineers there, fully rested, everything. Well, obviously we can't go back and change that. But what has been done to prevent further damage? Well, they made steel sarcophaguses, sarcophagi, I guess you would say. Here's the original one, which was built in shifts in, I believe, 1987, 88. They took 7-minute shifts like they did on the other earlier. and basically they started to build it like block by block or sheet of metal by sheet of metal, and every time someone finished a shift, they'd burn the clothes because there was so much radiation on it. They couldn't. It basically just polluted the area. Here is the new one that has been built in 2016, which basically just went over that one. Here are a few videos that I found interesting. Okay, and we're back.
More than 30 years on from the disaster that made its name infamous, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant still holds an uneasy fascination for many. The events of April 1986 have recently been dramatised in a HBO series. But what really happened? And why did it send shockwaves throughout the world? The Soviet Union invested heavily in nuclear power after World War II, and the V.I. Lenin nuclear power station, 10 miles to the north of Chernobyl, had become operational in 1977. There were 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site, each capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electric power. On the night of the 25th of April 1986, sleep-deprived plant workers ran a series of tests on Reactor 4 during a period of routine maintenance. They wanted to see whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. But they violated safety protocols and several power surges occurred inside the reactor. It led to a chain reaction of explosions powerful enough to blow off the steel and concrete lid. With the reactor's core exposed, radioactive material spewed into the atmosphere. Official reports claimed that 2 plant workers died in the initial explosion, but some estimates put the number closer to 50. Dozens of firefighters called in to extinguish the flames were also hospitalized with radiation sickness. With the Cold War still going on, the Soviet Union did all it could to avoid the disaster gaining international attention. It was 36 hours until orders were issued for the neighbouring town of Pripyat, built for plant workers in 1970, to be evacuated. By the time airborne radioactivity was being picked up at Swedish monitoring stations, the Soviets could no longer sustain secrecy around the event. They made a brief announcement on April the 28th, and an outcry over the dangers posed by radioactive emissions began in many Western European countries. To contain the fire blazing in the exposed core, sand, boron, clay and lead were dropped onto the flames. The Soviets then tried clearing debris with remote-controlled robots, but when the machine started breaking down in the toxic atmosphere, groups of men were brought in to clear 100 tons of radioactive material from the area. Later in the year, the first steel sarcophagus was built to contain the plant's 4th reactor. Despite being structurally unsound, it would remain in place until 2016, when a new container was built. Even with this protection, it's estimated the zone around the reactor itself will not be habitable for another 20,000 years. The Soviet Union eventually established a 19-mile-wide exclusion zone around the reactor, uprooting some 335,000 people. Nevertheless, a UN report asserted that more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the incident. Hundreds of thousands of people may ultimately have been affected. On top of this, it's estimated the disaster cost some $235 billion in damages. It contaminated almost 1/4 of agricultural land in modern Belarus and hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. Other than a few scientists and tourists intrigued by Chernobyl's history, the zone around the power plant is now eerily quiet and remains off-limits to anyone without a permit. Even today, the full scale of the disaster isn't fully understood and remains an area of active research.
Well, as you can see, here are my sources. I have a video, and I'll just wrap it up with this was a very, very bad disaster. Very bad is like the lowest you could call it. I mean, for something like that to happen, there's really bad engineering and that and decision making and ethical choices. So, thank you for watching my presentation, and have a nice day.